think everybody would agree that language is a very important component of people's sense of who they are. And so from a sociological point of view, you could say that language is one of the things that marks out my group and is a sort of a boundary stone. It's one of the things that allows me to say who the members of my group are, and conversely, of course, who isn't. Most people think of language in a purely communicative sense. That is, it's the language that you use ordinarily to buy a drink or go to the grocery store or attend school, all those ordinary, mundane things. But in addition to that, languages also have a very strong symbolic value. And the symbolic value can coexist with the communicative value, so that if I'm lucky enough to live in a community where my language and my cultural group have some degree of control, then the language that I do my shopping in is also the language that marks my sense of who I am. It's the language in which the poetry of my group has been written, in which the legends and songs and myths and so on are captured. But for some people who don't have that luxury, then the two aspects of language can become separate. And you see this very often in minority groups, particularly in immigrant situations, where practicalities have forced them to shift from one language to another, so that their original language no longer has the communicative use that it once did, but it may still retain its symbolic value. So in that sense, the short answer to your question is that even after communicative shift has happened, language, even if it's, as some people might say, has retreated to a symbolic, intangible or psychological level, it still has value in terms of group identity. And for some people within such groups, there is, of course, always the hope that that retreat can be reversed, and that the language which has lost its communicative value can regain it again, that the language that marks my group and marks my sense of belonging will once again be the language in which I go about my ordinary activities with my family and friends and at work and so on. And this, if you think about it, is the primary motivation behind many linguistic nationalism movements, where people want to regain a degree of control over their own destiny, and very often this linguistic component is an important part of that. So, to summarize, language is an important part of identity, and even when it's no longer used on a regular basis, or perhaps hardly ever, it can still, in its symbolic role, continue to act as an important marker for people. Yes, if you live in a bilingual or, of course, multilingual society, questions of language choice crop up very frequently. And most people, most of the time, are motivated by practical necessities. Monolingualism, as we know, is very much rarer in the world than bilingualism or multilingualism. That is to say, most people around the world regularly speak 2, 3, 4 languages. They often do so in quite restricted and limited domains. That is to say, they use different languages for different purposes. And in many ways, the selection is quite easy. I mean, if I go to market and I have to have interactions with somebody from another group, I may have to speak his or her language, or they may have to accommodate to mine, or perhaps we'll agree, as it were, to both speak a third language. All these sorts of things are very common. You do, of course, sometimes, getting back to this idea of language as a symbolic medium, you do sometimes find people who are interested in making bilingual and multilingual choices not primarily on the basis of communicative necessity, but as a way of actively promoting a language which they feel is has been forced by, let's say, some larger language, has been forced into some sort of a retreat. And there, in those cases, you often find a fairly self-conscious desire to speak another language, to make a particular point of speaking another language, even though, let's say, everybody around you is perfectly capable, perhaps more capable in your other language. Nonetheless, there may be political or nationalistic or ethnic reasons, again, having to do with identity and groupness, why you might make a choice which, at first blush, doesn't seem to be particularly practical. But as I say, in most normal cases, for most ordinary people going about their business, these choices are eminently practical. People develop various linguistic fluencies according to needs, and they tend, by the way, not to overdevelop them. If I need to know something of your language in order to buy something from you in the shops, it's not likely that I'm going to bother to learn enough of your language so that after I finish buying a pair of socks, we can then go on to discuss nuclear physics. That would be uneconomical. Why would I want to overdevelop a language? I mean, there'd be no payoff. And this brings me to my last point here, and that is that language choices are not necessarily difficult, and the experience of millions of people shows that learning several languages is not in itself difficult, but there is some sort of price to pay. It does take a certain amount of energy to learn another language and to become reasonably fluent, so it would make no psychological or social sense to extend that fluency beyond the limits of necessity. People want to learn languages for all sorts of different reasons. The primary one and the most obvious one is, again, necessity. The second most important one, I think, is to make a political statement, perhaps on behalf of your group, perhaps with the wish that by so doing or by making that particular language choice, you will be helping to revive your group sense of itself, particularly, of course, in its linguistic aspects. You very often, however, find people learning a language who have no intention of speaking it. I found this, for example, when I was doing some research with Gaelic speakers in eastern Canada, where there were many people enrolled in classes at different levels for learning Gaelic. But when I asked them various questions having to do with why are you doing this and what goals do you have, what do you expect to use the language for, virtually nobody said, well, so that I can speak it with other people. There was a very strong sense of duty. People said, well, I feel that my Scottish heritage will be stronger if I know something about my ancestral language. And some of them also went on to say that if I know something about Gaelic, perhaps I can read some of the old stories in the original Gaelic. So it was a cultural drive. So that's another aspect. And then, of course, there are purely scholarly aspects too, which in their own way also rest upon necessity. I mean, I may have research interests that require me to delve very deeply into another culture. And it may be very unwieldy if I do that always through translations. It may be almost entirely necessary for me to actually learn something of that other language. So again, that's another form of necessity, I suppose one could say. But it's a more rarefied, it's not the necessity that comes with having to deal with people in the shops or in the marketplace. It's a more scholarly or esoteric or educated necessity. So I'd say basically there are these sorts of reasons. Necessity at various levels, and then, well, it's still another level of necessity, I suppose, a perceived sense of political necessity. Or, as I said with regards to those learners in eastern Canada, a curious sort of sense of cultural duty, almost, that they would somehow be remiss if they didn't take steps to bolster the language and therefore their culture in this way. And for all but the most mundane aspects of necessity, language and culture are always related in people's minds when they discuss with you why they're learning a language. These two things are inseparable, I think.